They just have it wrapped around. And I don't think I want. I don't think I want the stand. I thought I would just take. Maybe.
Yeah.
Take it up over the table.
Well, I'm sure that.
One more.
One more time?
Well, that thin one. Yep.
Okay.
Looking better.
Yeah, that's good. Now we can just set it over there.
This
Blue cord.
what do I need the blue? What do I need the blue cord?
Another enlightening and lovely.
There, I think that'll work right there.
Get her out of her.
Yeah. You can move that over there. But yeah.
Skyboxes. Okay.
We got lots of cords here.
Yeah, it's a thing, I think. I take the grill and I stuff it. You like that? After the first salon I said, it's only hair. It's only, that's kind of where I am too.
Okay. I think that's gonna work. But how do you look at the presentation?
I mean, you can zoom in, but you can
I have a little, I kind of want to know more. 16 or is that better? Yeah. You know, I really
Yeah, that's what I think yeah, we should be able to.
So we'll chat about that more. Can you save it as a
What's that?
You can just save it.
Well, he yeah, you would make it. Just right now. Okay. Yeah. And you can make any kind of series of pictures using PowerPoint.
I've never done that, but yeah, I bet you confident young man is.
I think he is very confident. I've got like little jobs on there, ones that are made in the mail and stamped. And I'm hoping that he's right now making it into the annual meeting. We're gonna try.
last year or so, I had a film.
Because we switched over from Gary did it for years. And we switched over to
That's what I'm doing.
we're getting PowerPoint for now. Things done 2007.
Just sitting on
Do fireworks, 2 nights in a row, 4 to 5.
V, that was the best.
Okay, I apologize. You should make it.
I thought of that.
It's gonna be smelly.
You're ready.
I did send out my girl and Mike got one. And yeah, I think just do it.
Did I tell you about the Sunday one? Oh, not doing it. Heidi was doing it. You have to give someone a pay.
There's 38 photos if you need to know how many pages.
Well, you know what I did though? There were times I just printed out the one side of Eileen's postcards on cardstock. For thank you. So many postcards.
He was gonna return it and say this was cheap. This looks so good.
Wow, look at it, it's a big job, it's working on it, it's grinding.
That was not a small operation.
It's not Zoe's. The Nancy Peterson we're thinking. Zoe. Her name was her daughter. She was about 6'2". Played on the same team as my Zoe. So like people would yell at him, go little Zoe, big Zoe. And they actually were in the rotations of, you know, the one comes in and the one comes out. They were the. Here's my little Zoe. I'm 5, you know,
Oh, okay, so maybe we can.
Yeah, but probably,
I don't know too many librarians. You're the best one so far.
We're not that bad.
So you guys are wild.
and you're telling me that because I'll be sympathetic or give her access.
So you control A and control C, and went to PowerPoint,
Not
and
at all.
control B. Are you sure that was?
No, it,
Crazy.
It would be a big problem.
And it is
terrified.
It is one of them.
Oh, I see.
you went out there, nobody else.
Can we just do that?
Yes, there.
And then, but now, I don't want it to automatically go on. I want it to do like. Okay, but it's on automatic. Okay, that's all I need. We got it. Yes.
One more time.
That's what we wanted. That's not on, is it? Oh, it is. Oh, yeah, okay. Thank you for coming today to the brown bag. I just wanted to let you know that, the next brown bag we have is going to be Jim McKee again. We're gonna do, I think it's number 10, maybe, something.
11.
It might be 11, okay. I'm glad you guys are keeping track. And we still have our passports, and we still have a few people in running to have lunch with Jim McKee in the end, so. And I don't know if we might not go the full length to 25, because that might be too much. We might, when we run our passports run out, we might decide that that's the end for the passport, but we'll see how it goes. And then, also, this building is closing for renovation at the end of August, is my understanding. I don't know, I was gonna get the confirmation on that. It'll come out on the postcard. So I think that we'll have one more talk here, and then we're gonna move to the county city building, to a conference room on the upper floor. And I'll have to warn you, it's not as nice as this room. But,
Free parking.
you can get free parking in the garage next door, and they'll give you a little card to get out, so. And then Jim McKee's gonna speak a couple more times before the end of the year, and then I think John Roth might do one also, if I can get him, so. I'm gonna introduce our speaker, thanks.
Much better.
He's ready to wait now.
Good afternoon, welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burke, and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. The videotaping today is sponsored by the Preservation Association of Lincoln. Our speaker today is Mike Konz, and he's from Kearney, Nebraska. Mike has been a newspaper editor for 35 years. Most of that time he's been in Nebraska, first on the Omaha and Winnebago reservations in northeast Nebraska, and then at the Sydney Telegraph in the Nebraska Panhandle. After a 3-year stint in Colorado, he came back to Nebraska and to the Kearney Hub, where he's been the editor for the past 23 years. In 2012, Kearney was selected to host the centennial celebration of the Lincoln Highway. And Mike began researching and writing to produce a book for the celebration. And the book is titled Lincoln Highway, Nebraska's Longest Main Street, Celebrating 100 Years. And Mike brought some of those books today with him, so if you'd like to purchase one and have him sign it, he'd be willing to do that. And he also welcomes questions during the program. Please join me in welcoming Mike.
Thank you for the warm introduction, Eileen, and also thank you to the Preservation Association of Lincoln for inviting me to speak today. I was thinking on the way down here, why would the Preservation Society of Lincoln want to hear about the Lincoln Highway? And then it dawned on me. There's a common thread. The highway and the city are both named after an amazing American. And we'll get into the connection between Abraham Lincoln and the highway later in the program. Today, as I was rushing out of Kearney to get here, I ran down to the courthouse. I wanted to license my car because I'm going to be going on vacation on Friday. And so after I got my license, I had to go across the street to the Game and Parks Commission to get a sticker for the parks. And, well, there was street construction going on, and I had to walk through with my nicely polished shoes and get them all full of dust and dirt and everything. So as I was stepping back onto the sidewalk, I said, boy, I hope this won't be typical of the whole day. And then guess what? Here I walk down Centennial Mall, and there's all kinds of stuff to be jumping over and everything. So it was really wonderful to see the Centennial Mall project underway. It's something that we promoted at the Kearney Hub among our readers. We tried to encourage them to become donors and supporters of the project. It's a wonderful project because it links two of our state's treasures, the University of Nebraska in Lincoln and also our state capital. So it's really good to see that underway. Before I begin talking about the book, I'd like to make some acknowledgments. I'm the editor of the Kearney Hub, and I'm the author of the book, but I was by no means the only person who had a hand in developing and producing that book. And so I wanted to give some credit to those people right now. One of those people was Christine Gerber. She is from Omaha, and she's the owner of Omaha Books. And it was Christine who had this vision of what the book ought to be. She wanted to have something that was very visual and interesting and fun to look at. And to that end, she worked very hard in finding the imagery that appears in the book. She found postcards and really cool maps and signs. And she also went to the University of Michigan, which is the storehouse for all kinds of historical photos out on the Lincoln Highway. And you wonder why the University of Michigan? Well, we'll get into that later. But the idea for the highway began with auto manufacturers, and hence Michigan. The next person I want to thank and acknowledge is Julie Spears. Julie's the publisher of the Kearney Hub. And while I was having all the fun learning about the Lincoln Highway and riding my motorcycle across state to learn about the highway and meet the people and catch some of the color of the place, she was working behind the scenes really hard. It was her job to bring this all together and to arrange for the printing, figure out how we could sell the books, and all of the above. And so she didn't have the most glamorous role, but she had the most critical role. And then finally, there's a person at the Kearney Hub that I owe a lot to, and that's Kimberly Ray. Kimberly is a compositor, or she's a creative person, and she's just super talented, and she also is very intelligent. When we went to Omaha Books to put this Lincoln Highway book together, we needed to use a different layout program than what we were used to at the Hub. And Kimberly not only learned that program as she was producing the book, she actually produced a beautiful book. So I hope that some of you do want to take a look at them and maybe purchase them. I parked at the Cornhusker today, and I don't want to have to carry all those books back with me. So do me a favor, buy the books, please. Why did the Kearney Hub do a book about the Lincoln Highway? Well, next slide, please. In 2012, the Lincoln Highway Association designated Kearney as the site for its centennial celebration. It was back in 1913 when a group of automakers decided that it would be really smart if the United States had a transcontinental highway. And so anyway, they got all kinds of people excited about building that highway. And when they announced the route for the highway, it came through Nebraska. It entered at Omaha, and it exited at Bushnell in western Nebraska. But right smack dab in the middle of Nebraska sits Kearney. And with our facilities, the city's facilities, including the archway, it made for a really good place to have this celebration of the centennial. And we had a lot of fun at the newspaper. We wrote lots of articles making excitement about this event, because it's, how many times do you get the chance to celebrate the centennial of something that's so important to our nation's history? And so out at the archway, they rebuilt a brick section of highway. If you look very closely in the photo, on the top there's a sign that says Hammer Motel. The Hammer Motel was one of the hundreds and hundreds of hotels that sprang up along the Lincoln Highway after it was built, and travelers would stay at those places. They'd also stay at campgrounds. Sometimes they would stay at hotels. But anyway, the Hammer Motel was famous and in Kearney, and so it's got that display at the archway, along with that little section of brick street. We were able to talk about the history of the Lincoln Highway in our paper. You'll see some of these photos again in the presentation. If you were traveling the Lincoln Highway, you would look for those concrete signposts that have the red and blue lettering on them, and then if it was really a rich spot in the road, there would be a bronze bust of Lincoln on it. The bottom photo, that's important. Dwight D. Eisenhower is one of the people in that photo. He traveled the Lincoln Highway. And does anybody know the name of the interstate system that was built in the 1970s? Boy, you guys know your stuff. Okay, next slide. This was our front page on the day of the celebration. there were a lot of people that remembered the Lincoln Highway, and so we interviewed one of the women in our town who knew about it, and she made for a good interview and a good feature story that day. Of course, there were other pages in the newspaper that dealt with it. We put the bunting at the top of the page to kind of make it exciting, like this was a big patriotic festival. Each day leading up to the Lincoln Highway celebration, we did a question and answer section in the paper. We asked a little trivia question about the Lincoln Highway, and then the readers could kind of learn something as the event drew nearer. Okay, next. That's me on the motorcycle. As I researched the Lincoln Highway, I became very, very impressed with the fact that a lot of the people who traveled it in the early years, they had to be really gutsy people. You know, they had to go over these roads that you could maybe only go like 5 miles an hour at a time, or you'd break your backbone. And then you had to be ready to change your flats and get your motor repaired and find a place to stay. And all this without a car that's enclosed, you know, so you were exposed to the prairie winds and the dirt of the guy in front of you. And I mean, it had, I don't know, it must have been playing heck on horseback in those days. So anyway, I decided that I wanted to try to get a flavor of what it was like, and so I rode the motorcycle from Iowa all the way to Wyoming and caught a few bugs along the way. And in fact, right as I started out of Iowa, I hit a swarm of bees and went down my shirt. And I asked myself, I hope this won't be typical of the whole trip. So anyway, let's go ahead. I think that's it for the intro, isn't it? Okay. In 1913, Nebraska was at the center of what would become the United States' premier roadway, the Lincoln Highway. At the time it was conceived and built, the famous 3,400-mile Lincoln Highway ignited excitement across the nation. Americans were ready in 1913 to press hard on the accelerator. They were ready to bound from an age when railroads provided cross-country transportation into an era of freedom. They were ready for four-wheel machines and the ability to go anywhere those machines could carry them, including the 463 bone-jarring miles across Nebraska. Americans were ready for the freedom of the open road. They were ready to travel, even when it meant they were going to encounter many challenges: overheated engines, broken axles, and flat tire after flat tire after flat tire. Photos of early touring cars show multiple tires strapped onto those vehicles. The extra tires weren't there for good looks. Today, if our cars need a repair, we take them around the corner to a garage. But in the early days of the Lincoln Highway, automobiles were a relatively new invention. Travelers whose vehicles failed them often had layovers of several days. They had to wait until their car's replacement parts arrived by train. The manner in which automobiles were designed and repaired is just one contrast between transportation in 1913 and transportation today. Even the method by which promoters of the Lincoln Highway built the roadway contrasts today's approach. Today, we have office buildings filled with engineers to design our highways. We have state houses filled with officials who designate the funds. Promoters of the Lincoln Highway were pretty much on their own. They didn't have the hands-on support of engineers or public officials. In 1913, the Union Pacific Railroad, our nation's first transcontinental railroad, was not even 50 years old. Private investors had built the railroads, and so it followed that building roads was not primarily a government function. Headlight manufacturer Carl G. Fisher of Indianapolis, Indiana, is regarded as the creator of the Lincoln Highway. He was a gifted businessman. He's credited with developing real estate in Miami, Florida. And if you ever watch an Indianapolis 500 car race, you'll see there's a little strip of bricks along that raceway. Well, that's the original bricks that Fisher laid there for the raceway. In 1912, Fisher invited auto industry leaders to a dinner party where he outlined his vision for the nation's first transcontinental highway. The highway would stretch 3,500 miles from Times Square in New York City on the East Coast to San Francisco on the West Coast. Fisher proposed that the road be named the Coast to Coast Rock Highway. Anybody in favor of that name? No? Okay. 3 months after Fisher's initial announcement, he received a letter from Henry B. Joy, who was president of the Packard Motor Company. Joy's letter contained a pledge of money, and it also offered an idea that would amplify the public's excitement for the highway. Joy's idea was to memorialize Abraham Lincoln by naming the highway in Lincoln's honor. And that's when the highway, the name of it, was switched to the Lincoln Highway. Okay, let's look at some photos. This is a railroad bridge that still survives from the era of the Lincoln Highway. If you go east from Sidney, Nebraska, and get to about the halfway point to Lodgepole, Nebraska, this railroad bridge is there, and you can see it's the exact same thing. When I went on my motorcycle trip, I really slobbed out, and I was able to catch a Union Pacific locomotive coming across this short bridge, just similar to the locomotive in the upper photo. And it's typical of the Lincoln Highway that it followed the Platte River Road, but it also paralleled the Union Pacific Railroad is across Nebraska. So this is significant. This is Carl Fisher. No. This is Henry B. Joy. He made a number of crossings across Nebraska in his Packard automobiles. And in this spot, he's out in western Nebraska, and you can see there's some mules lined up, wondering what he's having for breakfast. Apparently he liked to rough it because he's cooking over a camp stove. But he was a big promoter of the Lincoln Highway, and his ancestors brought some of his original Packard automobiles to Kearney for the centennial celebration. So it was exciting to see those. You could join the Lincoln Highway Association, and you could pay some dues, which helped fan the flames of excitement, and maybe it would even build a half a foot of paving for the highway. But this was one of the methods they used to get people excited about that Lincoln Highway project. Okay. And as we said earlier, the highway was originally meant to be called the Rock Highway. Bad idea. And instead it was named the Lincoln Highway. And the bronze coin here was cast by Boy Scouts. They made a big project to put up those signposts along the route of the highway, and a lot of them had these castings in them. And a lot of the castings disappeared, probably by thieves. Okay, let's move on. Well, the promoters, they had an excited nation on their hands. Naming the road the Lincoln Highway had great patriotic appeal. The idea fanned the enthusiasm that was sweeping across the nation. Fisher and his friends needed to tap that enthusiasm in order to make their dream of the Lincoln Highway a reality. Instead of asking Uncle Sam for help, Fisher and his associates secured $10 million in pledges. The $10 million included $1 million from auto manufacturers. The auto manufacturers knew that if Americans had places where they could drive their cars, they would actually buy more of them. And the concrete factories, they also were excited. They contributed tons and tons of their product for the Lincoln Highway. These were generous donations, but they were hardly enough to build the kind of highway motorists would expect today. So the promoters capitalized on the groundswell of coast-to-coast excitement. Americans were enthralled by the dream of a toll-free, paved road linking their nation's two coasts. If your community sat between New York City and San Francisco, you couldn't wait for the Lincoln Highway's official route to be announced. The big news was announced in August 1913, but not before Fisher gained nationwide support for his idea. On the way, he gained support. He appointed a team to research and determine the Lincoln Highway's exact route. No surprise, Henry Joy, the Packard manufacturer, stated as a committee member that the most important factor for the route was directness. Other factors included easy terrain and natural paths while avoiding the congestions in large cities. Finally, on August 26, 1913, the route was announced. From New York City, the Lincoln Highway would go through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. Residents of Omaha were overjoyed to learn the Lincoln Highway would cross the Missouri River into their city. Marching bands performed and people danced in the streets. Fireworks filled the skies. An estimated 10,000 Omahans watched a giant bonfire of donated Union Pacific Railroad ties. That's how they celebrated that the city of Omaha would be on the route. From Omaha, the highway headed west across Nebraska and then through Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada, and finally California. In addition to Omaha, 46 Nebraska cities were on the Lincoln Highway's original route. Among those are Grand Island, Kearney, and North Platte. Grand Island became famous for completing Nebraska's first mile of concrete. Kearney capitalized on its location as the Midway City at 1,733 miles from both coasts. Nebraska's broad Platte River Valley was a natural corridor for travel. In the mid-19th century, it was the route of the Oregon and California trails, the Mormon Trail, and the Pony Express. Nebraska's territorial legislature had authorized early cross-country roads that followed the Platte River. The Transcontinental Union Pacific Railroad rolled through in 1866. When promoters announced the official route in 1913, they expected the highway to be complete in 1915, just 2 years later. That didn't happen. Okay, is this the first photo? Okay. You'll notice that this photo has a road sign and it says US 30. It also says Nebraska US 81. Who knows the place where Highway 30 and 81 intersect? Columbus. The Highway 30 was originally named the Lincoln Highway, and US 81 was originally named the Meridian Highway, and they both crossed right there in Columbus. And so this photo was taken kind of south of the city where that crossing was. You can see that there were lots of advertising signs, and many of them were within a couple of feet of the roadway. You can also see the manner of transportation that they were using. It's got a top on it, but there's no windows, so you're exposed to the elements. I would guess that this photo was somewhere early 1930s, perhaps. It's not at the heyday of the Lincoln Highway, but the main big highways of the time started out with names, and then eventually they were numbered, and so that's how the Lincoln Highway became US Highway 30.
What's the R?
R? I think there's a railroad track approaching, maybe. I don't know what it is. Okay. This shows all of the communities that the Lincoln Highway passed through, and you can see by the postcard that it was, by that time, renamed US 30, but it was a bustling place. When the Lincoln Highway opened to transportation, it opened up a whole new economy for the towns along the way. There now was room for hotels and repair garages and gasoline stations. Banks had to cater to travelers. And of course, there were restaurants and other services for the travelers. So it was very important to the Nebraska economy. When I was out in Sydney, I heard a story about how one of the local contractors was building a hotel, or a motel alongside Highway 30. And as the story went, the man was working so fast that he had a saw in his hand and he cut off one of his thumbs. And so anyway, he was pretty tough. He went to the hospital, and about 2 weeks later, he was back on the job site and working with one thumb. And somebody says, "Geez, Joe, you're pretty tough. Well, how did you cut off your finger anyway?" And he said, "Here, I'll show you." And he cut off the other one. True story? I don't know. Next. If you entered Omaha this is what you would see. And this was really beautiful at night. You can see that it has like Christmas light, ornament lights on the sign, but it was really beautiful at night. And this was Douglas Street, I believe. There was a big bridge that went from Council Bluffs into Omaha at Douglas Street. And gradually the Lincoln Highway headed west, and then it turned north a block or so, and then west again, and then eventually it became Dodge Street. Omaha really capitalized on the Lincoln Highway. There were many businesses that cropped up along the way, auto dealerships. Peony Park was nearby, some other famous businesses. In fact, if any of you read the World Herald, there was a story maybe 3 weeks ago about a rib joint that's closing in Omaha, and that was along the route of the Lincoln Highway. Okay, next. This is near Elkhorn, Nebraska. This is the longest surviving section of the original Lincoln Highway. Has anybody driven on this street? You get a good idea of what it was like traveling on the highway, don't you? Because it's not the smoothest pavement, but look at how enduring it is. That has been there for 100 years about. That's pretty amazing. And thank goodness somebody had the presence of mind to get a bunch of old cars together and take a picture like this. That's not my photo, it's somebody else's. But if you get a chance, go out to, would you say it's northwest Omaha where this is?
It's just outside of Elkhorn.
Is it?
Yeah, it's
like,
just east of Elkhorn, I think.
Okay. It's a nice, it's a neat thing to see, and there's a nice kind of signpost nearby that explains it. Again, this is what the signposts looked like that the Boy Scouts built along the highway. If you didn't have signposts like this, quite often the promoters of Lincoln Highway would paint red, white, and blue stripes on telephone poles or power line poles so that travelers knew the route they were taking. Okay. I think the Lincoln Highway was like a lot of endeavors back in those days. They were really in the hands of the promoters and marketers, and they sometimes the marketers kind of took liberties in how they described what travelers might encounter while they were on the road. So in its early years, only a small percentage of the Lincoln Highway was concrete. Some of it was bricks. Some of it was an early form of asphalt. The remainder, about 75%, was either gravel or rutted pasture. The early Lincoln Highway left much to be desired, but that didn't stop a travel writer from heaping praise. He described the road as being in, quote, various levels of excellence. The road was so excellent that motorists often experienced flat tires about every 25 miles. Of course, they didn't have very good rubber compounds then either, but man, can you imagine, Joe, it's your turn to change the tire. No, Henry, it's yours. So anyway, guess what their average speed was if you're taking a cross-country trip? 18 miles per hour. Kind of slow. Gradually, the Lincoln Highway was improved. Although the United States' entry into World War I slowed progress, Nebraskans gradually replaced rutted pastures with gravel, asphalt, and concrete. In 1924, most of Nebraska's 463 miles, or about 330 miles, was graded gravel. Only about 80 miles of graded earth remained. According to the Nebraska State Historical Society, in 1914, 1 year after the Lincoln Highway was established, the State Board of Irrigation, Highways, and Drainage biennial report stated that the route was, quote, in fairly good shape through the state, excepting in the western portion, where there is room for a large improvement. The west section had not been graded and was made up of deeply rutted trails. So you can understand why the Department of Drainage and Irrigation wrote that about the highway. Apparently we didn't even have a highway department yet. The west section had not been graded and was just deeply ruts. Those roads were passable when dry, but dangerous when wet. Okay, no need to explain this. I think that if you drove the Lincoln, and there's portions of the description of those early travel manuals that say that you don't really hit a base until you get down about 18 inches into the muck, and then you can start getting some traction. So I think that was one reason they used these small wheels like that, because then they would just sink down to the traction. But it was nice to have a lightly weighing car, because all your friends could get out and push you out of the muck. Nick? Okay, this is a highway. It almost looks like a wheat field to me, but the ruts help you to see where you're going. And if you look at the telephone poles, I don't see any signs there that show that it's the Lincoln Highway. So I guess you're advancing at your own risk in this photo. This is a camp kitchen and a campgrounds near Big Springs, Nebraska. This was significant because the Lincoln Highway originally was proposed across the country, but then a plan arose that there would be a segment of it branch off and head into Colorado. And people were really excited about that because, of course, scenic Colorado was a beautiful place for people to visit. And at that time, it was a place where people only saw photos of it in books or, imagined it as they read books or saw magazines. So this was a little business that sprang up near Big Springs. Okay, as the push to pave more of the Lincoln Highway continued, there was an idea that sprang up called the Seedling Miles. In 1916, the Lincoln Highway official road guide, the 1916 Lincoln Highway official road guide proclaimed, quote, "The tourist will find many indications that assure the complete future improvement of Nebraska's section of the Lincoln Highway." The guide highlighted the seedling miles at Grand Island and Kearney. Some of the first paved sections were the result of the Lincoln Highway Association's challenge to communities to build seedling miles. These stretches of concrete or brick were meant to show motorists the advantages of paving compared to gravel or earth. Under the slogan, "Great oaks from little acorns will grow, long roads of concrete from seedling miles will spring," Nebraska communities capitalized on the excitement. Central Nebraska's Hall County was a national leader in the Seedling Mile initiative. Hall County dedicated its Seedling Mile just east of Grand Island in 1915. And if you've been to Grand Island, you have maybe passed by the Seedling Mile Elementary School. Okay? Or maybe you attended it. A month after Hall County dedicated its Seedling Mile, Kearney's concrete section was complete. Guess how big it was? The Kearney Hub described the stretch of Seedling Mile as wide enough to pass so that 2 hay wagons could pass by on it. So it was maybe about 10 feet wide. After about 15 more years, Nebraska's attention shifted to paving the entire highway. Only small sections of gravel road remained into the early 1930s. As Nebraska's Constitution prohibited a state debt of more than $100,000, road projects often had to be constructed when funds were available. Finally, in 1935, paving was complete. This is a welcome sign into Grand Island. There's many, many remnants of the Lincoln Highway in Grand Island. There's actually a little section of their Seedling Mile that still exists. If you travel through the city, you can see gasoline stations and motels and even big hotels downtown that were the result of the growth and excitement that the Lincoln Highway generated. This is Kearney's Seedling Mile, and you can see how wide it was. It looks pretty smooth, and it was lined on either side by trees. It was a really pretty place to go. And it's difficult to see in the photo, but that's a Packard that's heading at us. Who knows, it might be Henry B. Joy in that at the wheel. This is one of the various different hotels that sprang up along the way. It's called the Midway Hotel in Kearney. Called the Midway Hotel because Kearney billed itself as the Midway City. The Lincoln Highway sign is up there in the cupola up above. This hotel burned down, they rebuilt it and it burned down again, and then they gave up and never built another one. Another business that sprang up along Highway 30 in Kearney was called the 1733 Ranch. It had that name because, of course, it was 1,733 miles to the east coast and 1,733 miles to the west coast. And this was a place where there were lots of entertainment and dances. Okay. Today, if you travel to Kearney and you go on to the west edge of the town, you'll see a pair of oxen like that, along with a Conestoga wagon. And as the Lincoln Highway Centennial approached, those oxen were just looking really rough and bad, and so was the Conestoga wagon. And a man purchased the souvenir shop behind it and restored these things. And so now if you passed by them today, it's looking pretty good. You can see back then it looks like it was the headquarters for gasoline pumps. You could stop and fill up and then make it the rest of the way into town. Okay. This was the stretch of Lincoln Highway between Clark's and Silver Creek, and they called it Lover's Lane. And you can tell why. It's really a beautiful stretch. Okay. In the early days, the highway was a threat to the early automobiles that crossed it. Flat tires were a chronic problem, so motorists carried several spares. More serious repairs, such as replacing a broken axle, required replacement parts to be shipped by train from urban manufacturers to service garages in Nebraska. Travelers banked on the availability of telephone and telegraph service in case they had to order parts. In fact, the 1915 guide to the Lincoln Highway, it had a city-by-city accounting of what you could expect where you arrived. It told you where you could find garages, how much it cost to house your car in those garages. It told you whether there was hotels, if they had telephone or telegraph, and you might need that telegraph to wire for more money or parts. Despite the many challenges, construction continued and Lincoln Highway enthusiasts could measure their progress. To drum up support for the Lincoln Highway Association, Fisher and his associates conducted a cross-country trip in 1913. The trip took 34 days. It took 34 days to get from one side of the country to the other. Later in 1915, the Lincoln Highway Association published its complete official guide. Authors estimated travelers could cross the nation in just 19 days. So that's the kind of progress they made. Real life, 34 days. 2 years later, they estimated only 19 days. That's about 180 miles for every 10-hour day on the road. The Lincoln Highway became the nation's premier highway. It was a leader in the evolution of highways that led to the Dwight D. Eisenhower system of interstates and defense highways. In fact, Dwight D. Eisenhower was a lieutenant colonel in 1919, and he was part of a convoy that crossed the United States, including Nebraska. And the purpose of that convoy was to gauge whether you could take military materials like that cross-country in a rapid fashion. And I think what Eisenhower learned was that you have to do better than the Lincoln Highway, and so he encouraged everybody to build the interstates. So, in 1974, Nebraska became the first state to complete its segment of Interstate 80. The route of the new interstate highway approximated the route of the Lincoln Highway. As an inspiration for more and better roads and a national network of interstates, the Lincoln Highway fulfilled one of the goals of its creator. Carl Fisher envisioned a road that would stimulate, as nothing else could, the building of enduring highways everywhere that will not only be a credit to the American people, but that will also mean much to American agriculture and American commerce. And Fisher achieved his dream with the Lincoln Highway. Thank you. looks like these guys picked up banners along the way as they crossed the country. This is Shelton. Shelton is the headquarters for the National Lincoln Highway Museum, and if you ever get to visit it, you'll see they've got beautiful brick streets. And around the corner from this, where this photo was taken, there's a restored big painting on the side of a building advertising, I think, shaving cream maybe? Can't remember. One of these gentlemen is Eisenhower, and that's part of the convoy that crossed the Lincoln Highway. And the end.
We have a couple more.
Oh, okay.
We got that one mixed up.
All right, I apologize. The top photo is Bushnell, which is as far west as you can get in Nebraska and still be in Nebraska. The bottom photo, the bigger photo, is in Kimball, and that's the Union Pacific Railroad over the top, and there's an underpass right there, and this is still in operation today. You can still get from one side of Kimball to the other by going under the railroad just like that. And of course, this is the modern interstate highway with the gratuitous picture of the archway in the foreground. And I think that's it, isn't it?
This is the last one.
Okay. You could see that when they put a sign up, they always gave you something to set a goal for. So you knew that Nebraska was that way and Wyoming was that way, and knew which way to go to get to New York and San Francisco. And it's only 46 miles to Cheyenne, so this must have been in Bushnell as well. Okay.
That's good.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Does Interstate 80 run parallel to Highway 30, pretty much coast to coast? I know it does for part of the way because I've traveled some on both of them. I don't know what happens way west. I don't remember Pennsylvania east.
You know what? I honestly don't know what happens out of Nebraska. We do know that Interstate 80 branches away from Highway 30 and it swings by Lincoln, and then it swings over to Omaha. And I forgot to mention this as part of the presentation, but Omaha was the original place where the Lincoln Highway entered Nebraska. But I think in 1929, they finished a bridge near Blair, and it was called the Abraham Lincoln Bridge. Okay. And at that time, the people from Blair waited until it was dark, and then they went down to Omaha, and they stole all the signs. And there's still people in Omaha who are bitter about that. So,
Try a state capital.
Really? It's still that way?
They seem to believe that.
Wow. They changed the route to Blair because they had that good bridge, and then they also sold it on the idea that it would shorten the route by about, I don't know how many miles, maybe 29 miles. So rather than going through Omaha, you go through Blair, and then you next stop would be Fremont, and you could swing down to Columbus eventually. So it was actually shorter to go that way. Question?
It was interesting to note on probably the fifth to the last photograph you had in black and white with the Chicago banner hanging off the back of the car, the accessory items people had put on right there on their car to have provide additional capacity. Notice there's a little scissor gate along the running board to haul additional material.
Oh, yeah, right here? Yeah.
Not to mention the privacy screen they built over the top of it. So you can occupy
Maintain
it,
modesty.
sleep at
Well,
night.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Any idea how many, at least within the borders of Nebraska, how many of those concrete markers have survived?
Oh, geez. I would just be guessing, but some of them are a dozen. Probably, that'd be fair, because a lot of them are have been confiscated, and they're maybe in somebody's garage or maybe in somebody's bar downstairs, or they're rare, and they're kind of cool when you think about how they came about. If you want to see an actual one, they have one at the museum in Shelton. But yeah, they're not. And I only saw, as I was doing my motorcycle trip, I was trying to find them, and I think I only saw 2 of them. One was in Lodgepole, Nebraska, and I think the other one was maybe at Duncan. Yes, ma'am.
How far apart were they placed, do you know, originally?
No, I would guess maybe every mile.
Oh, really?
I honestly don't know that. It would have been a huge undertaking for Boy Scouts to do that much.
I
But,
think there's still a marker on that original piece that
Mhm.
it doesn't follow this, that over by Elkhorn.
really?
So it's just north of Dodge and east of Highway 92 that runs right into at the south entrance into Elkhorn.
Uh-huh.
So if you go, you know, over to the east, take a right off of Highway not 92, whatever that
31.
highway is.
31.
31, yeah. Yeah, it's that way towards Omaha, kind of at the
Uh-huh.
southeast angle.
One other good landmark in Omaha is at Dodge Street and Saddle Creek Road. There's a cool original sign from Lincoln Highway there. And there's a really old building there. I think it was like a grain mill, maybe. But, yes, sir.
Were the medallions by the Boy Scout just a feature of Nebraska signs, or was it nationwide?
I don't know. I bet it was nationwide. Yes, sir.
I'm impressed at how similar some of the historic photos of the Lincoln Highway are to our perception of trail ruts from the Overland Trail.
That's true.
What was, and I'm thinking that lots of the things that might get mapped as trail ruts might actually, we have to make sure they're not Lincoln Highway ruts.
Well,
And what was the relationship between the Lincoln Highway and the historic trail and the Overland Trail?
well, I am not an expert, but I do know that Nebraska was an ideal place for travelers. Lewis and Clark, they tried to find the way west by following the Missouri River, and they got stuck, what was it, in Oregon or Montana, I think. But the Platte River Road was just perfect for traveling. And so along the Platte River Road stretched the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and the Mormon Trail. And so, yeah, there's a chance that eventually the Lincoln Highway route, or even the Union Pacific, which preceded the Lincoln Highway, they could have crossed. I do know that at Kearney, all three of those trails converged. The Union Pacific passed by there at the same time, and so did the Pony Express, and eventually the Lincoln Highway, and now Interstate 80. So there's a stretch of street in Kearney that's called 11th Street, and it goes to the Trails and Rails Museum, and that is where the one of those trails was. Yeah, I don't remember which one. Yes.
So pretty much, when you traveled by motorcycle, you were able to go the whole length, because it's all Highway 30,
Mhm.
right? Except the one section you said that used to go underneath the railroad, did they reroute that one around?
No, that, underneath the railroad, that was not Lincoln Highway. That was about 2 blocks north of the Lincoln Highway in Kimball, and it was a way for people to get from one side of town to the other. I apologize. Riding the route of the Lincoln Highway on a motorcycle is kind of boring because, like all kinds of Nebraska highways, it's just kind of a straight shot. You don't get a turn very often. And that's what motorcycling is fun, is when you get to bank into corners and stuff. But there's one spot along the highway where it's a pretty good turn, and that's near Potter. And there's actually a turn in the Union Pacific Railroad there that it's so sharp that they had to take that into account when they were building their big locomotives, like during World War II. They couldn't make them any longer than what could go around that corner. So I kind of twisted open the throttle a little bit and enjoyed it while it lasted. Yes, ma'am.
So did people become members of the Lincoln Highway Association? Is that how they paid for it, other than those big corporate donations? Were there just enthusiasts who would pay $10 a year or
Mhm.
something.
Yeah, and there still are. There's still an active Lincoln Highway Association, and a lot of the members came to Kearney last summer for the centennial. They came from all over the place. In fact, there were people that came from Scandinavia to visit Kearney for this thing, and they all drove their old American cars. It was cool.
But they didn't monitor other people using it. I mean, there was no way to keep non-members.
Oh, no. It was, in those days, a lot of the roads, and like today, there's a few roads that are toll roads. The dream of Fisher was to build a toll-free road, so anybody could travel it.
When did you start having government maintenance and government started to pay for it?
Well, I don't know the precise answer to that question, but there's mention in that Nebraska account from the Irrigation and Drainage Department that talks about some government involvement. The Nebraska government was monitoring how the highway was doing, and then later the presentation and the historical evidence I found talked about where they could not devote more money than to any project than the $100,000 that the state constitution allowed for indebtedness. So back then they allowed indebtedness. Now is there any state government indebtedness? I don't think so.
You know, who actually owned the right-of-way that the highway ran through? Was it owned by the U.S. government or Nebraska?
I think a lot of it was privately owned. Some of it skirted along the Union Pacific. I don't know if the Union Pacific yielded that land. But originally, the Lincoln Highway, when it approached the North Platte area from the east, they had a route that they called stair-stepping. And so as it followed along fence lines. It went like this, and then like that, and then like this, and like that. So it had to be privately owned, I would think, along that route. Yes, sir.
Editorial question.
Okay.
Isn't the apostrophe
Yes.
after the S on Nebraska on the wrong side of the S?
All of Nebraska owns it. All of the Nebraska.
Yeah. Good catch.
We'll follow up with the editor.
Tomorrow's edition.
I appreciate that. Yeah. This,
The geographic placement of those reservoirs is pretty freaking.
that's true. Okay. Well, everybody, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be here. Appreciate it.